Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, Exxon 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 1.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 7 and 9, Mach 2.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Op, line 3, red ball, avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for light in the gear handle.
Fuck. Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. I want to give a special thanks to Kevin Traud, Travis Barnes, and Robbie Walker for their continued support on Patreon for 20 Years Done. Okay, so today I'm joined by Colonel Retired Victor Mora, who I'm going to call Vic today. Is that right?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Vic was my group commander at Luke Air Force Base from 2012 or 13?
12 to 14.
Yeah, 12 to 14. And he was my group commander when I was going through a lot of growth as a senior NCO, working for a really good leadership team at the 308th. We were going through some challenging times and then a lot of victories. But I wanted to invite him on because there's never been a time where I haven't found his insights and his vision to be really, substantial and unique in the Air Force because of the emphasis he kind of placed on different topics. So, Vic, would you like to kind of give the listeners a idea of your career in a nutshell?
Yeah. So I served a total of 34 years, enlisted in 1985 while I was still in college in the reserves at Corps. So I started out as a jet engine mechanic, two-striper. Got my degree and kind of like most college graduates, tried to figure out where they wanted to go next. I applied for OTS. It was during the lean years of the late 80s, but I was fortunate to get picked up for a class in 1990. Got my degree, got my commission, and then I went to Langley as my first duty station. And then from there, it was just kind of all over the place. AMUIC, maintenance supervisor, those kind of jobs. And then squadron command eventually. And then when you and I met for my first group command at Luke in 2012.
And what did you do after that?
After Luke?
Yeah.
Yeah. So after Luke, I went to another group command at OSAN. And then from OSAN, I finished up on staff at Ramstein as the Deputy Director for Logistics and Engineering. So the Deputy A4. And
how long have you been retired?
I retired almost a year ago. It'll be a year on 1 November for my actual retirement.
Yeah, that time dilation when you retire is real because that year probably feels like it was really long, huh? That's how it was for me.
Yeah, I everybody told me when I was retired, well, many people, especially my old first sergeant said, hey, I can't see you being retired. I see you lasting maybe 4 to 6 months before you're back in the grind. And I'm really not missing it a whole heck of a lot, I'll be honest with you.
Right.
Miss the people, though, right?
Yeah, that's fair. Absolutely fair. Yeah. And that's also probably why I'm doing this, right? It's a chance to reconnect with people. So I wrote a story about you 2018. I can't remember which one. I'll post a link in the comments. But it was really about how the first time I met you, you surprised me with, hey, what is my number one priority? And I was completely caught with my pants down. I tried to use my superpower to bullshit to figure out what it was. And you really kind of like, you don't know it, you dismissed me. But I certainly know it now, but it was your number one priority was to develop airmen. And the way you explained it was all your other priorities would happen naturally if we developed the airmen that we had in the force. And in 2013 or 2012, especially in the 308th at the time, we were under some really dire sort of situation in maintenance, juggling in avionics upgrade with the training syllabus, a reduction in personnel. And when you were pushing the develop airmen, I believe that was not a realistic sort of goal. I recognized that it had value, but I didn't think it could be done. And in hindsight, I think you absolutely did it because you made it the priority and made sure that was the the vision for the group, and a lot of things did fall in line as you predicted. And in 2012, I didn't think I didn't think we'd have the resources for it. And ironically, we had sequestration manning cuts in 2014 and sustained ops tempo. So it feels like very often you think you don't have the bandwidth or the resources to develop your people because there's these more pressing things to happen now, but that development is an investment in your future capabilities, and you can't keep deferring it, or else you run into, a tightening of resources of experience and leadership. So I guess, how hard was it for you to develop Airmen as your number one priority? And is that something or where did you get that as your number one priority and vision? How did you form that?
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. When I was a second lieutenant, I worked for a guy named Gary Decker. He was my SMO back when we were under the fighter squadrons, and I was an assistant AMUIC, and we were in TAC at that time. And Gary Decker said, TAC has a saying, mission first, people always, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody kind of knew it. It's like every other kind of trite saying we have in the Air Force. And he told me, we were just talking one day, and he goes, that's bullshit. He says, take care of your people and they'll take care of the mission, and that's all you got to worry about. And that turned out to be something that I carried with me throughout my career. As far as making it a priority in command, I think part of that was coming up through the years and seeing how often people were put into positions of responsibility where they weren't ready for it. And so now you end up with a group of, whether they be officers or enlisted or civilians, who are thrust into a position of responsibility and do not have the tools to work through the tough problems, right? I think of an aircraft, and if you've got a flight control problem and you change a deflick on an F-16, well, chances are that's going to get it. That's not a hard problem.
Right.
When you have an aircraft that keeps coming back with a flight control problem, who has the critical thinking to be able to figure out exactly what's going on with the aircraft? Pretty simple story, but that's analogous to how you run an organization. When you have really wicked hard problems, and the 308, I'll be honest with you, when I got to Luke, that was a wicked, hard organization to kind of crack the nut on what was going wrong. But when you have those wicked hard problems, what you don't need people that can go out and find a simple solution, because generally speaking, the simple solution is going to be the wrong answer, right? You need somebody that's able to unpack the problem, get down to some kind of a root cause, do a root cause analysis, and then put together an action plan, and then kind of track through that action plan. We don't do that with our development of our airmen, right? I mean, we do have some leadership classes, and don't get me wrong, the stuff we learn in PME, whether it's on the enlisted or the officer side, I think gives you perspective. But it also, I think, leads to a lot of whining, right? Whereas the reality is the Air Force business, and aircraft maintenance in particular, is a hard business to be a part of. I mean, the demands are tough. The hours are long. It never seems like you're doing enough. But the reality is, if you have guys and gals that can explain to the entire organization what it is you need and how you think we can best get there, open that up for discussion and critique, right? And then put the plan together and communicate that plan. Then what you have is potentially, what you can create is an organization that can move forward. What I see in maintenance is we do the same old thing over and over again. We're getting behind, everybody's on 12s. What does that solve? When I was at OSAN, I don't know if I did this at Luke, but I did it at OSAN. I said, nobody works a 12-hour shift unless you ask me first.
Mm-hmm.
Did I piss off a lot of chiefs? Absolutely, right? Oh, you're taking control away. But the reality is, I wanted to have somebody to be able to come back and explain to me what they're going to accomplish, what the plan is, before they just arbitrarily put everybody on 12-hour shifts. So, and I'll tell you, and you probably experienced this as well, there are a lot of folks that wear the rank, whether they be chiefs or colonels, that don't deserve to wear the rank,
mm-hmm.
And don't deserve to be in the positions that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, our promotion system is one that, if you stay around long enough, chances are you're going to get promoted. And I didn't want guys and gals getting promoted who did not bring the skill set to that particular job. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I remember specifically in 2013. Certainly in 2013, that was, it seems like a lifetime ago, but that was very much in the era of the complete box checking for senior NCOs to get stratifications for senior and chief.
Yeah.
And I knew there was a particular senior NCO who was woefully under qualified to be promoted to senior, and they had both CCF and course 14, course 15, whatever it was. And what I heard, you had specifically said, no, that person is just not ready. He shouldn't be stratified. And that to me was like groundbreaking for someone at your level to clearly, because like I'm sure you remember, because you did the enlisted piece and you seemed like you were very observant coming up as to what was healthy and unhealthy. Like when you're below these particular people that are incompetent and they're very much supported by the competency and the efforts around them to kind of hoist them up, like all those people working extra hard, not necessarily for that person's intentional benefit, but indirectly benefits them and makes them look good. They get really frustrated when those people make rank, because it's like, how do you not see that this person is not qualified? And it robs people of the will to try, because it's like all of my efforts are just making the unfit people get promoted. So when you did that, when you could see that from above, it to me was like substantial that, it felt like there was a fundamental fairness that was going to happen, at least at our group, about who would be put in the right positions, not because of arbitrary ancillary sort of metrics of box checking, and who really is competent and critical thinking, those intangible soft skills of leadership, who gets the mission done while simultaneously rallying their people and increasing morale and building camaraderie, things that we've tried to chase on EPRs and stuff like that, but it's really muddied down because you can't tell. But you had single-handedly created an environment where that was now important, and promotions were going to be based on that. So certainly I wrote like 17 notes while you were talking, so we'll have a lot to unpack. But that for one was really big. But you also mentioned that, when you get those critical thinkers, when you're doing more than the superficial fixes, and I really feel like when we're talking superficial fixes, we're not just talking about aircraft maintenance, although I think that's certainly a problem. I've gone into quite a lot of detail in some of my writing about, we often seek to green up a jet, not fix a jet. Like we're focusing on getting it on the schedule and the metrics, and not realizing the metrics are supposed to speak for our health, not to be manipulated to belie an unhealthy organization as healthy. But also you're talking about quick fixes in PME, you're talking about quick fixes in promotion, everything. And I think it all goes back to, we always feel like we don't have the resources to really do the deep level work. But you said it's also important that when someone has critical thinking, or they can see a problem, or they can work through a problem, that the leadership is open for discussion and critique. And in my experience, very often leadership is not open for discussion and critique. But you certainly seemed like you were. Yeah, it's verified. It's recording. So unfortunately, we missed the entire conversation about open for discussion and critique, and a bunch of people watched me run off and close my front door. So that's where we're at on our podcast right now. So to kind of recap, I asked a question about how, as a leader, do you maintain open for discussion and critique? And you kind of talked about when you went to mission orientation that you intentionally asked, kind of surveyed the field about what and the answer really needed to be that you didn't necessarily know everything, and you're relying on the entire organization as an entire entity to kind of fill in all the gaps for each other as an interdependency. And then often you would go out to the line to seek information. And you talked about, meeting with some weapons troops that were standing around for up to an hour on the jet, and you realize there was a lot of waste in how they were being managed, which is two things. It's indicative that the unit is not in some way healthy in process or in management, but it's also interesting because you're signaling the airmen notice that. The airmen notice the time they're standing around as wasteful to them, or mismanagement, or it feels like you're not moving. Because when you're at work, especially in the 308th at the time, likely, like we were struggling, and any waste when you're not moving in a good direction is going to be frustrating, because it's like everyone wants to dig out of the hole. And when you're not digging, but you're at work, that's like really harmful morale too. It's just spinning your wheels.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think as leaders, we need to encourage, especially in the military, we need to encourage a noisy system, right? A noisy
Right.
feedback. Um, but as you saw, and I saw throughout my career, there's so many folks who are so concerned about the next job, the next rank, the next position, the next, you name it, that they don't want to make waves. And that's unfortunate, especially when you work for somebody that says, "Hey, I want you guys to be noisy." I had a senior master sergeant at OSAN. So keep in mind, you know, I went from Luke, my first group command, to OSAN as my second group command. So I kind of already knew the things that I wanted to get accomplished and what was important, as well as having the wing commander kind of say, "Hey, these are the things I need you to focus on." And I tend to talk a lot and kind of philosophize out loud. But I had one senior master sergeant that came into me, and he said, "Hey, sir, you said give you feedback when we have feedback." And he came in to my office, and I could tell he was really nervous. And he sat down and he said, "Hey, you know, sir, you are the smartest person in the room. I can tell that." And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. This is what he said. He says, "You're the smartest guy in the room. Why do you always have to remind us of that?" And that was quite the eye opener for me.
Interesting.
Because if you know something, right, the last thing you want to do is make people feel stupid that they don't know it, right? Now, I'll have to admit, in the maintenance business, when you're sitting at the end of the table in a morning meeting, sometimes you do that, and probably more often than you should, right? Because you have this expectation that those around the table are operating at a certain level. What you fail to realize, and this was kind of one of my blind spots, is that not everybody has that same experience level or the same opportunities that you had. One of my first sergeants from Nellis, when I was the AMXS commander there, Eric Dupree, said, "Sir, your problem is you think everybody's like you." And he says, "What you need to do," and I wish and I said this at my retirement ceremony as well, one of the things I wish I would have done better is what Eric Dupree taught me. He says, "You need to meet people where they're at and then bring them where you need them to be," right? It's a great saying. In practice, it's really, really difficult, right? And that's, I don't say that as an excuse. I'm just saying, for me personally, it was a blind spot for me because I wanted, I just wanted people to move, people in responsibility and leadership roles. I wanted them to move faster because I knew that 200, 300, 500, however many airmen they were responsible for, they're counting on them to get it right. And when they don't get it right, that's an entire organization that's suffering. Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Like the make people feel stupid. That's something that, and I 100% get it, because I really kind of fell into that trap as well. Because it's like it's not an intentional thing, but it's you. For me, I would get frustrated sitting in that room when solutions were so clear and bullshit people were saying was also equally clear, and it's like, I don't understand. Like, you just gotta, it's not even peeling back the onion, it's like taking the fucking sticker off the onion. That's the amount of research we need to do on this. And everybody's just accepting these things. And very often I would go down these, not necessarily rabbit holes, but it would be a soapbox of something that I'd seen so repeatedly that I almost had like a cassette tape of a rant lined up to go, because it was so frequent. I mean, it's certainly ironic that I'm now hosting a podcast talking about things. I think part of that is because you probably, and I think I as well, felt like you need to be smarter, because as you said, there's a lot of impacts downstream from if you're not performing up to a level. But then it goes back to your develop airman thing, and part of that developing airman is room to grow at their own pace. And then obviously I certainly experienced it, the intimidation when you're highly competent or highly intelligent in the processes or the organization really shuts down people from wanting to engage, because it's almost like they're afraid to engage in a conversation because they're immediately going to be drowning, and they're also afraid that it's going to belie some sort of career impact as well.
Yeah. I think part of the culture in maintenance is we beat each other up, right? And for me, especially as an '06, what I had to recognize that not everybody's in the maintenance community, right? And so when I'm dealing with others outside the maintenance community, I have to be very careful because they may not be as thick-skinned as what we're used to in the community. The flip side of that is, why do we expect that our maintainers are going to be so thick-skinned all the time, right? And I'm not saying coddle people, right? But I think we need to treat them as adults. We need to hold them accountable. We need to teach them, absolutely, and develop them. But then as leaders, we also need to hold them accountable, right? And as wherever you are in the food chain, you have to hold your subordinate leaders accountable as well. And I think that's where a lot of that impatience came from for me, is that you just want people to do well. And that's why for me, developing airmen was such a big thing. I saw, especially at the master sergeant level, which is, to me, everybody says, the work that the Air Force has done on the backs of staffs and techs, and that may be true, but the actual development of our force, I think, rests with master sergeants. And you've probably seen it. I've seen plenty, especially when master sergeant wasn't boarded before,
right?
Where folks they would be in over their heads, right? And I would bring them in my office as a squadron commander, and I'd say, so what were you thinking? And you get this blank stare.
That's terrifying.
How did you, and here's the one question that I think everybody was afraid of for me is, how did you reach that decision? And if you can't tell me how you reached that decision, I'm a little concerned, right? Because I don't know what the calculus was. I don't know what you considered. And that gets back to this whole idea of how do you teach people to think critically, so that if somebody asks you, how did you reach that decision, you have an answer it may not be exactly right. In other words, you may have missed something along that decision-making process, but at least show me that you had a process. And then we can start talking about that process. The decision may or may not be important at the end of the day, but the way you got to that decision, to me, is always important.
I suspect that their "I don't know" didn't actually mean they didn't know. I think they recognized that their process was either selfish career-wise, or born of ignorance or inexperience. And at that point, it's 100% ego protecting. And of course, in the Air Force, for promotion, ego and promotion are interconnected. You're right. Like I can detail exactly what choice I made, and as long as I'm behaving in a moral, ethical, and I'm doing it for the right reasons, but it results in an outcome that is unexpected or unwanted, I have no qualms about dissecting. Here's the choice I made and why. This is why we did the engine removal instead of the mod prep, because this is a flyer tomorrow, and the mod prep, those guys were late anyway, and I was counting on it not being ready, or I was counting on mids. You can do all of those things. And obviously the risk of aircraft maintenance is, especially as a swing shifter, which to me was always super frustrating, was in the morning they only see the negative outcomes. Then they see all the information that you didn't have when you're making those decisions, and certainly probably happened at the group meeting for you as well, where you have the benefit of, you have all this cumulative data of what actually was the end result. But I always got the impression that for you, and I sat on your meetings multiple times, either because I was an impound official, I came up with Chief Roberts or something. But I never got the impression that the only time I ever saw you, and I say beat up, I don't mean beat up as in like bad, it was ask those probing questions to get each layer out. And then the reality is, when someone has a known bad process, they quickly kind of collapse into the lack of logic or reasoning in their decisions. But it was very much why did you do this? What made you go to this? And people, I think the wrong people, or people that are, like you said, in over their head, I think they get really nervous and skittish when probing questions start hitting, because they know that foundationally it wasn't a good choice, and they're trying to protect that decision.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the morning meetings, because I think it's kind of like this. I should probably say it this way. I'm not sure what the average aircraft maintainer thinks about the morning meetings, right? Do they think their OIC gets beat up in there, or whatever the case may be? But for me, what drove me crazy about the morning meeting, and I grew up like this, just like all the other young CGOs do as well. They go to their morning meeting, right? And then they come with this almost canned speech that they want to throw out there. And then they throw it out there, they brief it. and you ask one question and it falls apart, right? And I was telling people, close your books, right? Turn off your cell phones, no texts, and let's have a conversation about the fleet of your aircraft and how well you're prepared to fly today, right? And that, I think the first time I told people at Luke to close their books was like, I thought they're all going to go into shock, right? Oh no, I can't open my, well, look, again, you had a flight control problem, you change a deflict, whoop-de-doo. I mean, you know, I'm not, that's not what I'm after. What I'm after is, how are you overseeing your maintenance operation? What shortfalls occurred? What processes failed? What succeeded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things. And at the end of the day, look, as an aircraft maintainer, we're there to put jets in the air so that the pilots stay proficient, whether it's in a training environment, hitting their training squares so they can graduate, or if it's out in the field so they can maintain their currencies. And if you don't understand that, in my opinion, you have no business being in the aircraft maintenance community, right? And especially not in any leadership position.
So I always found when I went to that morning meeting, I had at the time, I had the benefit of around 15 years and only exclusively F-16 maintenance on Block 42. So I had quite the mental encyclopedia available to me. But I'm curious what your thoughts are, because some of those people in that room were a lot of them were first lieutenant AMU OICs that had been, and some of them had spent some time not in maintenance initially, or had kind of traveled around a little bit before they were AMU OICs.
Yeah.
So, you know, you had the benefit of a lot of years. I had the benefit of a lot of years. A lot of chiefs on the wall had the benefit of a lot of years. But I wonder how hard it is for an AMU OIC to synthesize theory of operation in real time at the morning meeting, to know why the deflict was the fix versus a wow switch or anything like that, to come to the meeting and be able to brief beyond their notes. Like that, to me, seems super intimidating and hard to do. I imagine it created a lot of neural pathways and growth, but initially that probably felt like an impossible request to them.
Yeah, but part of it too, Chris, again, developing airmen, right? Here are the expectations. If you want to call yourself an AMUIC or an assistant AMUIC, these are the things you should be able to do and communicate back to your group commander or back to your maintenance supervisor or whoever. The first time, if you come in and you say, I don't know, okay, well, let's go find out, right? Now, if you have something similar, right, a week, 2 weeks, a month down the road, and you come back in and you say, I don't know, well, now I'm a little concerned.
Right.
Right. So I don't expect, I didn't expect, and I wouldn't expect it today. I wouldn't expect anybody sitting at the table to have the exact answer, especially for coming from somebody who spent, you know, decades literally around F-16s, right? There are some nuances that you just pick up on that it's just experience. But that's usually what didn't get people kind of hung up, right? Or kind of get the spotlight put on. What got the spotlight put on is they'd blurt something out, and then you'd ask a follow-up question, and then the BS started coming in, and then before you knew it, you just tell them to just, okay, you're done. Don't answer any more questions.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it's just making it worse.
You hit rock bottom, and you're just digging deeper.
Yeah,
right. But again, who developed that lieutenant? Who developed that tech sergeant, that master sergeant, that senior master sergeant? And I think, as leaders, we want people not to necessarily, we don't want to have to tell people what to do all the time. What we want to be able to do is communicate our intent, right? And then once we communicate that intent, have subordinate leaders carry forward on that intent. And this is, I'll never forget, this is a Luke example, right? So that group had like 17 or 18 chiefs in it. And I'm meeting with them on a regular basis, at least monthly, as a big group. And I'm trying to communicate, articulate, hey, this is where I want to go with the group. This is my intent, right? And I was probably about a year in. And I pulled one of the chiefs aside, who was not the group chief, but I pulled one of the chiefs aside who I trusted his judgment and his candor, to be honest. And I said, why is it that these chiefs don't get my intent? And this was very telling, right? He looked at me square in the eye. He said, sir, they get your intent. They just want to know, they just want you to tell them what to do.
That's scary for a group of chiefs.
That is scary. But what it points to, I think, is I want explicit direction so I know I'm not going to get in trouble, or I know I'm not going to step out of line, right? And we just don't operate that way. And again, how do you develop folks, men and women, that have the courage to take somebody's intent and go out and execute without having anything more than these pretty wide left and right boundaries? All right.
Absolutely.
I could not have functioned if, when General Harris hired me to be the group commander, Luke said, "Hey, Vic, I want you to do this, that, and the other thing," right? And what General Harris told me when I sat down with him for my very first interview for expectations, he said, "You're here for a reason. I want you to go do what you know is right."
Wow.
That was it.
That's quite a broad mandate, right?
Yeah. And you know, you just, that's just kind of where I wanted people to be able to operate, right? Understand what I'm about, and what I want for the organization, and then help us move forward. General Rothstein, when he was there, you know, you talk about the whole promotion thing. This one struck me. I mean, right away, he looked at us as the group commanders and the senior staff. He said, "You are responsible for who we promote and who we don't promote."
Nice.
Right. So if you're complaining about a chief, a captain, a major, or whoever, guess what? You promoted that person.
Yep.
And that to me, and I think General Rothstein, I don't think he was the best boss I ever worked for.
Yeah.
Bar none. That one, I mean, I took that to heart, because again, you think about the folks that are subordinate to that person or persons, and you're responsible for that organization being the way it is if somebody isn't prepared to fill the shoes, fill the role.
And while we're talking about General Rothstein too, like I had a few interactions with him just because of the nature of my profile while he was the wing commander. But I remember he specifically did a wing commander's call where he talked about moral courage for the whole time. And it was like, I mean, I always had that sort of nugget in me anyway, but really it was him dedicating that much time to talking about how that needs to be the starting position for how we approach issues of what is the best moral outcome, and you need to have the courage to stand up and do the right thing. That was something that it feels like that should have been a regular sort of conversation throughout my career, considering integrity first is one of the core values. But him saying that really energized me to change how I approach to things that I believe to be toxic or abusive, because it's like, you know, and I've said it multiple times, so it's a little bit of a broken record. When I was an airman on the line and I would see some horrendous treatment of people, I always wondered, where the fuck are the master sergeants that are supposed to be like pushing back against this and creating space for us to work in a healthy environment? And then I really realized as I came up in the ranks that they were trying to balance getting promoted with also taking care of their people. And oftentimes those things are dichotomous, and more times than not, they would choose their own promotion on the idea that the more rank you get, the better you can take care of your people. But in my experience, the reality is you can take care of your people at any rank. You just have to stand up and hold, you know, there's this weird thing in the Air Force where leaders hold subordinates accountable, but honestly, subordinates can absolutely hold leaders accountable, and they often have a better perspective of a leader's fitness to lead than those above. All it takes is to say, this is wrong, and I'm going to go and I'm going to tell anyone and everyone what you're doing. And the reality is, when people know they're doing something wrong and they find out that you're going to start exposing it, they very quickly back down, because again, they're still trying to protect their career or their promotion. So, you know, I always call it career chicken. You know, I'll drive my career into yours and I'll win because I don't care. But I saw you writing notes. What did was it the moral courage that got you?
It's funny. I just wrote a note down there that, you know, one of the things that kind of drove me throughout my career is that, I'm accountable to my boss and I got to produce results and I've got to do the job, right? But ultimately, I'm responsible for the guys and gals that are put in my charge. And I think if people realize that as a leader, you're responsible, you're accountable for those that you lead, right? We'd be in a much better place. I think, you know, one of my old sayings is, if you want to know how good you're doing as a leader, is look to see who's following, right? Mm. But I don't know how many people really internalize that downward accountability. I heard it a lot, but I don't know that the actions were always aligned with that.
Well, accountability is only as good as the force, that the accountability applies. Like you can say that, yeah, all this stuff matters, but the reality is very, very often subordinates don't have much accountability or can't hold their leaders accountable without going outside the chain or up the chain, which has potential career impacts. In which case, if promotion is the goal and accountability, really in the Air Force, if most people that have issues with, we'll say, empathetic leadership or servant leadership, very often they are focused on promotion as their vehicle for success or self-worth. Accountability to them is only going to be possible promotion impact type of functions. And in order for a subordinate to affect change on a supervisor's promotion, you're talking about that subordinate has, the avenues, you're talking IG, congressional, Article 138, climate assessment survey, media, which is, a death sentence, or just walking into his boss's office. And they have less faith. For me, if I have a terrible squadron commander and he's operating and he's been terrible for a while, I automatically assume the group commander is also bad because he's allowing that leader to fester. So now how much faith am I going to have that I can circumvent that squadron commander, and the group commander who doesn't know me from Adam is going to listen to me or side with me? Never mind the fact that very often leadership are very afraid or hesitant to expose problems downstream, because ultimately as leaders you're responsible for the environment you create down below. So it's this almost like self-serving or insulated sort of process of lack of subordinate lack of accountability to subordinates.
I think so when I talk about accountability to subordinates, I'm not talking about external accountability, I'm talking about internal, right? In other words, it's that internal recognition that I am accountable to every last person in my organization. And if you internalize that, right, then communication becomes easy. Holding up or not recommending somebody for promotion because they're not ready becomes easy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't get me wrong. It's never easy to look somebody in the eye and say, hey, I'm not going to support you for promotion. But I think when you weigh that against, in an AMU, a couple hundred people, right? Then that conversation becomes just a little bit easier, as well as, hey, if you want my support for promotion, here are the things that I need you to do, right? Here are the areas you need to improve upon. I don't know how many folks get that kind of direct feedback when, as the senior person in the organization, I come to you and say, sorry, I can't support you for promotion. Or as in the case of Luke, when we did our senior NCO of the year, competition. I don't know if you know this story or not, but obviously the chiefs all get together and they the squadrons put their packages in, and they picked this one individual to win. And I said, no way. That guy, I said guy, that person is not going to represent my group as the senior NCO of the year. And the good thing is as the commander, and even the chiefs recognize, I had that discretion to do that. Interestingly enough, that individual came to my office and said, I did everything I needed to do to be your senior NCO of the year.
He didn't. He obviously missed something. And it wasn't, he was looking at it as, I was the top 3. I did this volunteer work. I did this car wash. I worked at this. I did this development, because he could only see quantification of his abilities as an airman / leader, senior NCO, as these are the tangible things that I need to do, completely missing what you're talking about, which are the when you talk about like internal accountability, which I agree with, by the way. I was only operating from the mindset of we're so lacking in internal accountability that external accountability is often our only pathway to fixing problems. But internal accountability, you're talking about, you put your people first, you care about your people, you're accountable. Like if they're getting divorced because of you can't get their work life in order, that you're indirectly responsible for that family stress and all these other things. Like that's a real thing. And it's, obviously the more people under your charge, the more weight of that internal accountability kind of applies. And obviously if this gentleman walked in your office and said, I did everything, he completely missed the boat.
Yeah. And I don't want to talk bad about him, right? So if you think about the system, our system, before that individual even came up, right? That was the system. And from my perspective, I want to say shame on you, Chief so-and-so, for not explaining to this individual that is not what gets you recognition in this group. What gets you recognition in this group is performance, taking care of your airmen, right? Doing the thing. I remember having a conversation with his squadron commander and his chief. I said, what are my priorities, right? Blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
What did he do to develop airmen? So how then can I recognize that person as the senior NCO of the year if they're not even accomplishing what our goals are for the group? So yeah.
And what's interesting too is, in my experience, it certainly goes back to, obviously, in that article I wrote, I touched on the impound that we worked together. There was very much the sense.
Is that the light in the gear hand? Is that the landing gear impound?
Yeah, that was the anti-skid. There was also a brake failure at the same time where General Rothstein actually took the barrier, the flight before I took over. Yeah. And then we did anything and everything. And then I was so certain it was going to be good. And then it immediately flew and had an anti-skid light. And then I was certain you weren't going to put me back on and yaster me back on it. I guess that spoke to more of you respected my processes, even though the process didn't have the outcome it needed. My process is a good process. I need to spend more time. But what's interesting about that is it very much seemed like, for you in particular, there always seemed to be a path of redemption. Like if somebody was underperforming and they weren't meeting that standard, I always got the sense that if they kind of were willing to accept their shortcomings, which really is hard to do with the way our promotion system is set up, plus being in maintenance, ego is always kind of seeping into these things. But if they're willing to go, yeah, this is where I fucked up, absolutely, and I need to work on these things, he's right. And then they made real changes to how they approached the processes and grew. I always got the impression that past failures you would never hold past failures against people. I mean, maybe never is not the right word, but I always knew there was a path of redemption with you.
Yeah, I think again, that's your responsibility, right? Is that number one, you have to learn to accept mistakes or lack of judgment, whatever the case may be, because people are still developing. And you saw it, Luke. I removed like 2 or 3 MXS OPSOs because they just weren't ready for the job. And in particular, at Luke, one person responded well. I said, hey, we're going to start you over here. We're going to do something like this. Another person decided to pursue an assignment and locked it in before I had a chance to say, no, this guy doesn't deserve to go to this particular assignment. And the one person that stayed and kind of worked through eventually ended up being a squadron commander, a successful squadron commander, and she did well. At Osan, same thing. A guy had been out of the community for a little bit. He was running an AMU. He was failing miserably. I said, hey, we're going to slow you down. We're going to start you over here in a different area. Ended up working kind of through some different, what we would consider lower level jobs for a senior captain. Proved himself. We put him in as a CMS maintenance operations officer, and now a successful squadron commander, right? The thing is, if you don't pause, and people hate it, right? I don't want to go lateral. I don't want to go down. But if you don't pause to get into a place where you can learn the skill sets that you need, then all you're doing is continuing that path to failure, right? And even with you and anybody else, look, it's you have to take the time to sit down and talk through what didn't work, right? That perspective. And I'm not the end all be all, but it is a different perspective that I bring to the table and say, hey, what about this? Let's think through this. And if you're not offended by somebody, especially a group commander, right, questioning you, I will never have the same technical expertise as any airman out there on the line.
Right.
But I have seen quite a few things over the 2 decades worth of time, right? And so when I ask a question, it's not that I'm not trusting you, what you came up with. I'm trying to get you to look at it from a different perspective, right?
I want to circle back to one thing. When you were talking about the OICs at the meeting with their script that were kind of very superficial and unprepared, that to me, and I certainly saw that at the AMU level because I was sitting in a room as the TAM's flight chief or something. And I was seeing a load of shit being sold to the OIC from the other shops that I knew from my experience, like those aren't good fixes. That right here, the super talking, I'm like, none of these are fucking good fixes. And until you showed up, I didn't feel an obligation to air that out because I didn't want to like throw my peers under the bus. And the OIC could sell it to the group commander that wasn't going to peel back more than a sticker or the first layer. But then when they started coming back, you know, like, hey, like he asked all these questions, and then what you guys said, that didn't line up to anything, and I wasn't ready. Then what I would start doing those meetings, and also was in the 308 that had a very healthy command climate where we could really kind of unpack things, was when somebody would say something that was bullshit, I would immediately go, I don't think that's how that fucking works. That's not, in my experience, no, that's not right. Let's look at, and I would read the notes. I would read the notes for avionics and go, that stinks. That's not how that works. My loyalty was to, A, let's get quality fixes on the jet first. And two, if I can set up my OIC to go up to the group meeting and crush it, then you as the group commander is going to have less influence, and there's going to be less stuff external of my AMU. And I really think it's important for AMUs and squadrons, maybe to a lesser degree because I had less exposure to it. AMU should be their own little ecosystem of maintenance with their own command team that they, like you said at the very beginning, this is what I want. It's up to you guys to figure out how to do it. And I think that's really, really rare. But how much do you think it was because there were master sergeants grossly underpreparing the OIC and selling a line of BS at every morning meeting in preparation?
Well, I think, you know, from my perspective, I saw two things. One, I saw a command structure from the group commander that really didn't hold anybody accountable, right? So, and nothing against that particular individual, but when you go through 60 some odd slides in an hour and there's not a single question in your morning meeting, that to me was pretty telling. And then, you know, again, I think we perform to whatever level is expected of us, and not everybody. I mean, because that sounds really bad, but we tend to adjust to, this is all they need. That's all I'm going to give them. You could be doing more in the background, which is fine. But I think just as humans, we tend to do the least we can, and it takes somebody like you to come in and say that's not good enough, right? And I remember just something as simple as doing exercise. Nobody likes to exercise, right? But it's one of those necessities where you make sure your force is ready for whatever may happen. And again, I go back to General Rothstein. He says, I'm making this hard. Right? There are some wing commanders that all they want to do is pass, right? But he wanted to make it challenging, and probably to the chagrin of many of the folks that were in my group at OSAN. Guess what Vic Mora carried with him at OSAN when we went into an exercise, right? Hey, let's not make this easy for us, right? If all we want to do is get an outstanding on paper, then let's just write the outstanding. Let's not even bother exercising, right? But if we really want to test our capabilities, then let's make it hard. And I remember in one exercise, and I know I pissed the entire group off, we said, hey, what happens if we start, right, and we have to generate just a small amount, and then we have to go full blown? How would we respond? And then can we generate a small amount covertly, right? So the plan was to do 6 aircraft covertly while we're continuing to fly, which is a little bit harder than just generating 6 aircraft. And so we did that, and we failed miserably. And talking to the wing commander outside, this was on a Wednesday or Thursday. And I think it was a Thursday. I can't remember, but anyhow, he said, "So what do you want to do?" I said, "Sir, we need to do it again."
Can you unpack what you mean by covertly? Do you mean like so that way it wasn't obvious to outside people looking in that you guys were generating aircraft, or that the AMU didn't know what one hand was doing or whatever?
No, it was more towards you know, this idea that in South Korea, the North Koreans are watching what we're doing all the time.
Right.
So when we exercise, it's a pretty obvious thing, and what we wanted to be able to do was to generate, or in our minds anyways, generate without kind of raising suspicions, right? And so the AMUs, both of them had a flying schedule, and they both had to generate 6 aircraft. And I can't remember what the timing was. I think it might have been 12 hours. It might have been 6 hours. I think it was 12 hours. But regardless, we didn't get there. We didn't even get close. So Tank Leonard was a wing commander, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "We need to do it again." Right? So the next morning, guess what we did? We did it again.
Wow.
This was in the week prior to our scheduled exercise, which we had to start generating on Sunday. So in that time frame, we went through 3 generation exercises in the maintenance group. And were people tired? Absolutely.
Yep.
But when we went to the full generation, the group did fine.
Mm.
And I think when you set that high of a standard and you set high expectations, our airmen will always surprise you. They will amaze you with what they can deliver, as long as they understand why they're asked to deliver it. Right.
And that's a good point. So I also want to circle back around. It's interesting that the wing commander was focused more on making it hard for the readiness of the force in South Korea for basically a real world threat. Let's make this difficult so that way, if something were to happen, we are more prepared than just reaching an outstanding rating. And that's a big difference between, what is your priority? Is it to look good or is it to be good? And in this case, it was to be good, because the reality is, if there is a real world engagement, you need to be good or else it's going to be a terrible outcome. I think that's rare too, not just speaking for exercise's sake, but very often I would see a lot of people who just were more interested in looking good than being good, because oftentimes that met their career needs. But I think setting the standard high, I think that is true. If you set the standard high, most airmen will reach it. My thoughts on it are, when you get to a certain level of resource restriction, eventually what resources are you going to pull to make that happen? And very often it's going to be people's health is adversely affected, relationships are adversely affected. So it's like when General Mattis did that 80%, when SecDef Mattis did that 80% fighter readiness mandate, I kind of railed against it, because I had a feeling that the force was going to break from this. Like, I thought there was going to be some catastrophic sort of events, because I 100% agree. Those 5 fighter airframes should absolutely be at 80%. I think it was projecting for a near peer or at peer real world sort of scenario long term, but we need to be healthy in our fleet to address those things. My thoughts and concerns were, doing it within 1 fiscal year is really naive for understanding how fragile the aircraft maintenance sort of environment is across the force, between low experience, low personnel, coupled with my real concern was there would be people that were, I kind of dubbed them careerists. I'm not sure if that has a negative connotation yet, but people that would eagerly go to try to chase that metric. So it was another block on their EPR that say met SecDef's 80% fighter readiness mandate within 9 months, given 12 months, and they're just going to grind up their people to reach it. Like, setting a high goal is fine, but I think there's also an important understanding of, have we actually resourced our people for this, and have we let them know and certainly we're reaching it, we're going for this goal for this purpose, and I think you can do it because of these reasons, and if we can't, I need to know what you need in order to do it. And I think oftentimes those conversations don't happen.
Yeah. So in defense of the maintenance community on that particular piece, I was at USAFE as a deputy director, well, as the chief of aircraft maintenance and munitions maintenance, and then as a deputy director as that thing evolved. And to the credit of all the MAGCOMs, we all came back with, yeah, we can do it. You just need resources to it.
Yep. That's the answer. Agreed.
I mean, we all came back with the same. Now, the reality is, okay, so in a constrained environment, what can you really do? And I don't think we really had an honest conversation across the community of what could we really do.
Right.
And I think that's where it kind of went astray. 80%. And the other thing is, to me, the SecDef says this, and it goes across all the services, right?
It does.
For somebody that's been in the fighter community from time he was a second lieutenant, you recognize that 80% is just a number.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, that's really all it is. It's not an indication of fleet health. You need to dig deeper than that. It's not an indication of how many aircraft you can generate at any given time.
It's the laggiest of lagging indicators there is.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And so again, Osan, we would go home at times under that 80% number, but I had enough to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do that. And people thought I was crazy because I wouldn't let them work weekend duty. And I would do that. Why? Because the airmen needed a break.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's interesting to me that, and I think you guys saw the same thing in the 308, is that if you put solid processes in place, guess what? Airmen maintainers don't need to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't. Right. there was an assistant AMUIC out in Osan, and I was leaving, and he was just, we were kind of talking through things. He's a lieutenant. I said, how many weekends did you have to work over the past year? And he said, not counting OTIs, which sometimes drive weekend work. He said, but he goes, I think I had to work, we as an organization had to work 2 weekend
Wow.
days.
That's wild.
Yeah. But working with ops, so you kind of get a lighter schedule on Fridays, or you're down earlier, or whatever the case may be. And then I think giving your airmen incentive, right? Look, get it done. We won't have to come in this weekend, but we're not above 80%. It doesn't matter. The group commander says if we get to X number of aircraft, we can go home. Now, there's danger in that, right? So if you start off broken on Monday and you break again on Monday, well, guess what? Now you're just in a hole.
Yep.
But you don't think our airmen understand that?
Yep.
Right.
100%.
They get that. They're not going to patch together a jet on a Friday night just so they can go home.
Yep.
Right. Because if they do, guess what's going to happen on Monday? Yeah. And Andy Gamache was my AMUIC prior service F-15 crew chief, and he got it. Oh, Chief Newsom got it. Matt Newsom was my chief out there, or his lead pro super at the time. He got it, and it was amazing to watch.
That's a big deal.
Work hard during the week, absolutely.
Like right? When you showed up at Luke in 2012, when the 308 were spiraling bad, I was working as a expediter. I was working probably 15 to 17 hour days, and when you got there shortly after, obviously it was Chief Roberts and the rest of the leadership team in the 308th, and we went to 6 days a week of 12s. I was like, oh, thank God, I'm going to get some time off. Like, I was really looking forward to a 12-hour shift so I could do a face-to-face handoff. I wouldn't have to do my notes for 2 hours after I got off. And I was really looking forward to that. This sounds so bizarre, but it's really important to your point. That Saturday of dual shifts on 12s, we cleared our plate so much because we weren't flying, so we weren't actively braking. We were getting a lot of work done. It helped us dig out. And what's really important, like when there's a surge in maintenance, need or ops, we'll say ops tempo, but I'm broadly speaking about when you need to put a lot of manpower resources at a hole that you're in for maintenance. If the people know that it's temporary, like we need to get out of this because by kicking it down the road, we're elongating this process and making it miserable, and we're actually creating more hours. If we can just do an intense surge of maintenance effort to include the weekends and all this and all hands on deck, we can get out of this sooner, and then we can throttle back and give you way more time back. And it's important that, first of all, it takes trust in your leadership that it's not just going to become the new normal type of deal, because there's the guardrails are really loose on how much you can use people in the military. But so it takes trust there, but it's also when it's time, when you've met that goal, you throttle back, you give people time. So that way there's faith that it's not going to be their forever situation. I think a lot of times leaders are very poor at communicating when there's a surge in maintenance effort. Why, for how long, and what are we striving towards?
Yeah. I agree with you. I've got so many stories, but it as an AMXS commander at Nellis, I had that come up with our F-16 unit. They had lost their adversary air. They're coming to the end of their class, and they're like, the only way out of this is if we fly our own adversary air. And for us, when we did the calculus, it meant every single jet, 18 jets, had to be available. And we thought, okay, we'll give it a shot. Canceled training, which was not popular, right? Pulled some people back from leave, or canceled leave, or put it on hold, whatever you want to call it. And we scheduled this session of the syllabus over 2 weeks because we thought for sure we're not going to make it, right? Mm-hmm. I got up in front of the organization. I said, hey, here's what we're going to do. I need every single one of you guys to pull. I was there for, out on the line every day when we were going through this. I mean, literally everything we had was on the schedule. That AMU had was on the schedule. And we scheduled for two weeks. Like I said, thinking we're going to break. They were done in 5 days. 5 days. I thought, man, that was amazing. And then, oh, by the way, guess who's walking around, 9 feet tall, chest puffed out, saying, hey, we just did that. Right?
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, that's something you could write home about because you just don't see it. And I didn't do it. As a squadron commander, all I did was communicate a need, and then I became a cheerleader, right? I mean, those airmen out there it was just amazing.
And it's an important piece. And I noticed this too when I was in the 308th when we were working a lot of hours, especially with Holly Gramco as our OIC. What you said was this is the way we're going to go. And you were out there with them the whole time, kind of marshaling the troops, but also you were not immune from the hours and kind of the effort as well. And Holly was the same way. You know, I would often see her leave long after I did. She was pulling way more hours. She was working as hard as everyone else, even though it wasn't as physical, but she was with us, right? And that's a really important piece of leadership. Of it's not because of my position, I don't have to do the shitty work anymore. That's for the peasants type of deal. So you guys do it. If you didn't like it, you shouldn't have been peasants, as Yzma says from The Emperor's New Groove. But you know, that's a really important piece, and it also has to be natural. It can't be like a leadership checklist. Oh, when you're doing exercises, you need to be out and about, and you need to do these things. Like people can tell when it's a disingenuous engagement of a leader out on the line or interacting with the workforce. If it's only during specific situations, you're like, oh, okay, so it's the exercise, so now we're going to see this person. We never see him any other time, and he doesn't know us, he doesn't care about us, but he feels like he has to. Like, it's a big deal when you go out and you interact with your people, and the same expectations and the same sort of adverse conditions you've levied on them because you need it for the mission, you subject yourself to as well. It absolutely validates the leadership decision to the people.
Yeah. I don't want your listeners to think that I think I'm all that. I'm just a guy that came up through the ranks. I changed the things that I didn't like either when I was an airman or when I was a lieutenant. And I constantly ask myself, do I deserve to be in this position? Do I deserve the rank that I'm wearing? And to be honest with you, there are days where I'd look at myself, I go, man, you fucked that one up, didn't you?
Yeah.
You know? But like anything else, you get up and you say, all right, how do I do that one better? And you bring up Holly. She will tell you our time in Osan, I had such high expectations for her that I drove her into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no excuse for that. We have since kind of patched up that experience. But the reality is that you have to constantly be on guard.
Yep.
You have to constantly ask yourself if you're doing the right thing. You have to recognize that although you think you have the right answer, it may not be the right answer. I mean, even if you're right, say you're right 90% of the time, right? As a group commander, and I can't say that I was right 90% of the time, but even if you give yourself that, right, that's an A. That 10% of the time that you're wrong, you're screwing with some people.
Yeah, and it could be some pretty severe damage because of the power and authority.
Yeah.
So I had one more thing, and then we'll do final thoughts. But when you came to Luke, how hard was it because the difference between running a squadron and running a group are pretty significant. The squadron is, you don't have a whole lot of policies outside a few personnel policies, whereas a group, you are literally setting the tone for the entire maintenance effort with your policies and direction. How hard is it to take over a group where there's policies that are carried over, that you have to break some policies, you have to break some culture, and then you're only there for a short 2 years? And in your case, I felt like, and certainly that's a subjective opinion, that the group from when you showed up to when you left was certainly healthier. But how hard is it to take over a group, having a lot of work to do to change how the group behaves based on the predecessor, and then also turning over the group 2 years later, which has kind of become your baby, and watching it grow or anything like that? Is that difficult, like having to at the group level?
Yeah, I think so. When you're, for an officer, we change organizations all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a year, 18 months, 2 years. 2 years is probably the longest I stayed in my first assistant AMUIC job for 3 years. And that was the longest job that I ever held. And so you're used to turning over organizations. And the hardest thing to do is to hear somebody come back to you after you've left and say, hey, remember when you did this? Can you talk to so-and-so, your replacement? And the answer is no, you can't, because that's now his or her position. And I think over the years, that's probably what drove me to invest in people, not in organization, right? I know I'm going to leave, but that master sergeant's still going to be there, right? That chief may be there a little bit longer. The staff sergeant will definitely be there. And so if you invest in the people, then some small part of you stays in that organization. Now, if it's a staff sergeant, that impact's going to be small, relatively small. If it's a senior NCO, that impact's going to be a little bit bigger. And then when you're talking about officers or chiefs, especially young chiefs, that impact goes organization wide. And so I've kind of resigned myself early on to the fact that once I leave an organization, I can't look back. Right. I mean, I do, don't get me wrong.
Right.
And there are people that'll tell you, oh man, when you left it, whatever. But I take a little bit of consolation in knowing that I left a Chris McGee behind. I left a Holly Gramco behind. I left a Larry Sapazzi behind at Osan, who learned and grew and has a sense of who they are as an individual and what's important, right? I think I left behind a lot of officers that will look at metrics completely different from the way they did when they first encountered me, or if not, know that their beliefs are reinforced or were reinforced by their group commander, because I'm I don't care about the metrics. What I care about is the mission, and they're not diametrically opposed like people think they are.
Right. The metrics tell the story of the mission. Like that's what's telling. That's your points of your plot points, right? Yeah. And it can tell you where your health and your cancers are. Do you have any final thoughts before we're done?
I would just say that for all your listeners, if you're in a position of leadership, I mean, take that responsibility seriously. It's not a stepping stone to another job or another rank, and really internalize the sense of I'm responsible. I'm accountable to every person in my organization, up, down, and lateral. And I think if you do that, you're going to be much better off, right? If all you do is continue to chase rank, our Air Force will never get any better.
I think that's pretty powerful. So, Thank you very much. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if we chat again at another time, because I still have a lot to unpack here, and I appreciate it. But yeah, thanks for sitting down, and thanks for certainly taking care of me in 2013.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Chris. Thanks for reaching out.
Adios. That's the show. I can't thank you enough for reading, listening, and watching and supporting everything that I've done with 20 Years Done. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend you go to 20yearsdone.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/20yearsdone.